Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Chris Carnevale, and I am the Climate Advocacy Director with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And our presentation today, we will be going over our 7th annual Solar in the Southeast report, presented by the report's lead author, Heather Ponen, SACE's Senior Energy Policy Manager, and report contributor Brian Jacob, SACE's Solar Program Consultant. We have reserved time for questions at the end of the presentation, and for Q&A time, we'll be joined by Maggie Schober, SACE's Research Director. You can submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we will go through as many as we can following the presentation. We have a lot of attendees today, and I anticipate we'll probably have more questions than we'll have time to answer in the 1 hour we have allotted for this webinar, but we will work to get through as many as we can. If you are with a media publication, please indicate that to us by either changing your name in Zoom to put the name of your publication or note it in any questions that you submit in the Q&A box. We are recording this webinar, and so we will share the video of the webinar with you afterwards by email. And also the report that we're discussing today is published and live on our website. And in our email follow-up to you, we will include a link to that also. Next slide, please. So this report is presented by us at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. The Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible and equitable energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. As a leading voice for energy policy in our region, SACE is focused on transforming the way we produce and consume energy in the Southeast. I want to take a moment to thank our members who are on this call. And if you're not a member yet, but you're interested in our work and would like to join, please check out our website at cleanenergy.org, and you can join our email list and become a member. And with that, I will turn it over to SACE's Executive Director, Stephen Smith.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody, for joining. Next slide. We're very proud and to release the 7th annual Solar in the Southeast report. Why we do this and why it's so important to focus on this technology. We're living in unprecedented times. The Southeast is extremely vulnerable to disruptive and weather patterns and the climate crisis that we're seeing, play out across the world. It's been an unprecedented just in the last 2 weeks. We've seen an amazing set of records being broken, and both with sea surface temperatures, the earliest hurricane to form in the Caribbean basin, and to become a Cat 5 in extraordinarily quick time to cross through, hit the Yucatan Peninsula, and then go on into the Gulf of Mexico, and then reform as a Cat 1, which you would think wouldn't cause the amount of devastation that we've seen through Texas. And there's still hundreds of thousands of people struggling with power outages and everything through Texas, and then it went on through the United States. And then last night, over the last 24 hours, we've seen unprecedented straight line winds in the Chicago area that led to a historic number of tornadoes actually touching down, and due to the heat and the humid weather clashing with a frontal system that came through. The climate crisis is complicated, but it really isn't. It's really about the fact that we're putting too much energy into the atmosphere and into our oceans, and that excess energy not allowed to escape is creating these disruptive phenomena that we're experiencing in the form of, the record heat waves, the record sea surface temperatures, extraordinary storm events, and then messing with the jet stream to where we see these unusual dips of the polar vortex, and then the unprecedented flooding and that we're seeing, and fires and all this. All this is a reflection of energy, and that energy, excess energy in our atmosphere and the ocean, comes from the choices we make about how we produce and consume energy. And that's why this report about a technology that is ready to go, that is a real solution, that can be a workhorse technology, and is in some areas and needs to increase, is so important. Next slide. So what we're really focused on at SACE is how do we address this unprecedented challenge to humanity in the form of the climate crisis? It's all about how we decarbonize, because it is the fuel choices we make that is the main driver of putting this energy in the atmosphere and the oceans that lead to these disruptions. And how we decarbonize is what is the top focus at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. So focusing on retiring energy generation technologies like coal and fossil gas, using renewable energy that works with nature's forms and flows in the form of using solar is so critically important. We're also looking at how do we electrify transportation and mobility by moving away from, the internal combustion engine and how it adds to the problem, and then how we can be more efficient about our energy choices, squeeze more work out of each kilowatt hour that we produce. These are all critically important to what we do. And this report is focusing on this workhorse technology. Now, unfortunately, in our region, only one utility so far has really expressed the level of ambition and commitment to really embrace solar as a technology that can be the driver, and that's Florida Power and Light. We'll discuss a little bit about that with their real zero targets. The rest of the utilities are lagging behind. They're not embracing the technology at the scale that we feel is necessary. We're not moving the goalposts. The climate crisis and the science behind it is challenging us to do more and do it quicker. And that's why, even though we're seeing tremendous amounts of growth in solar, we're still not on the scale that we need to have to really solve this problem. So you're going to hear us discuss what's going on, how the trends are happening in the Southeast, who's leading and who's lagging. And I also want to really emphasize the fact that the decisions that are going to solve this problem are based in good decision making and good policy. And that good decision making, good policy is reflected in the choices that our elected officials and our leaders make. We've seen through some investments here, through the Inflation Reduction Act and other commitments to focusing in on transmission, because one of the real hindrances we'll talk about in this report is the fact that transmission is becoming an impediment because of the balkanized way that the utilities in the Southeast do their utility transmission planning. We've got to clear that problem out, and you'll hear us talk a little bit about that. And I also want to emphasize that we're going into a very important election cycle. Please learn and understand about who the people are that you're voting for and what they're doing to address this very serious issue. So with that, I want to turn it over to Heather and let her lead you through the report. And I appreciate everybody joining us.
Thanks, Steve, for that introduction. So Heather Ponin, Heather Ponin here. Trying to go back. Okay. So I'm going to be walking you all through some of the report findings along with my colleague, Brian Jacob. As Steve noted, SACE is a regional organization. And so with this report, we're really striving to look at solar progress at both the state and the utility level. And we do this by tracking and compiling utility resource plans, which is something that I'll talk about in greater detail in a couple of slides. But we track resource plans as well as project level data that's reported by utilities to federal data collectors. And doing this allows us to get relatively comprehensive figures for total solar capacity in the region. And we're particularly interested in comparing utilities to one another. So in the case of this report, we do that by looking at total solar capacity divided by the number of customers to get a solar watts per customer ratio. And again, this is something that we're going to kind of come back to a little bit in the later in the webinar. And I'm going to quickly also note the geographic coverage of this report as well, because when we refer to Southeastern utilities or the Southeast, we're talking about a specific grouping of utilities in 8 different states. And you'll see from the map that there's actually partial coverage of some states, and that's actually intentional, because we focus on vertically integrated utilities that do not participate in interstate electricity markets. So you'll notice that there's partial coverage of Mississippi, and that's because there are some utilities in Mississippi that participate in MISO, for example. And in North Carolina, some of them participate in PJM. So that's why. And Kentucky is covered just for the TVA portion. Okay. So we're going to start off by looking at how much installed solar capacity the region currently has, as well as how much solar utilities are planning to deploy in the future. And that top line number shows that the Southeast reached approximately 22 gigawatts of solar in 2023, and that's on a full year operational equivalent basis. So one takeaway here is that if you look at the entire time scale, this graph goes back to 2013, it becomes quite striking how good utilities have gotten at getting solar projects up and running. So collectively, the utilities in the region have been making larger and larger capacity deployments in shorter timeframes than ever. And one illustration of this is that if you look at that 22 gigawatts figure for 2023, that's about 4 gigawatts higher than the previous year. And so that incremental 4 gigawatts that was deployed in 2023, one point of comparison is that that's equivalent to the cumulative solar amount that the region had in 2017. And that took quite a few years to get there. And so we're seeing those larger capacity deployments in just a single year. And that's really something that is going to continue in the future. And I'm actually going to sidebar a little bit here to talk about what goes into the forecast, since this is just sort of a common question that we get. The forecast is driven by our tracking of utility resource plans. So the resource planning process varies by utility. Some file them every 3 years, while some file them every 5 years. But in most cases, utilities are actually required to file resource plans by state law. And the plans kind of model how much capacity is needed to meet demand under different scenarios. And so that's generally how we know how much solar utilities are planning to deploy in the future. So we do include those aggregate capacity figures for future solar resources in utilities resource plans. But a lot of the time that solar has yet to be sited as a specific location. So anyways, the other finding here is that by 2027, we're actually going to about double the amount of cumulative solar that the region has. So that 22 gigawatts figure, just about increases to 44 gigawatts in 2027, which is kind of the 4-year forecast that is included in this report. Okay, so here we're again looking at solar capacity, but this time it's by different states in the Southeast. And so I'm going to go from highest to lowest, starting with Florida. Very obvious here that Florida utilities have a strong lead in total installed solar capacity. A lot of that is due to that leadership from the state's largest utility, Florida Power and Light, that Steve mentioned earlier. And that cumulative capacity is expected to actually more than double from 9 gigawatts of solar in 2023 to 20 gigawatts in 2027. And I'll also take this opportunity to note something that I should have done earlier, which is the different colors and project types that are included in this chart. So the blue segments of the chart represent utility scale solar. And the yellow ones represent distributed solar, which is predominantly rooftop solar. And so it's really notable here, if you look at Florida, that Florida is really one of the only states to have a significant amount of capacity coming from distributed solar relative to that total capacity figure that we have. Okay. So moving along to North Carolina. North Carolina is currently second in the Southeast in solar capacity. And but the forecast indicates that Georgia is expected to surpass North Carolina in 2025. And that's due primarily to a couple of large utility scale projects that are coming online from Georgia Power. And I'm going to move all the way over to the right to point out the lower end of the scale, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi. It's a little bit tough to see, but there are several utility scale projects that are upping that capacity in 2024 through 2026 that are coming from TVA. But despite this, these states still have a lot of catching up to do. And it's unfortunately that lack of that historical lack of ambition from utilities operating in these states that has made it difficult for them to keep pace with the rest of the region. Okay. And we're going to dive a little bit further into the details by doing different comparisons of different utilities in the region and talking about the resource plans and how these utilities perform on a watts per customer basis and kind of compare and contrast the different utilities. And that is something that my colleague Brian Jacob is going to be doing. So I'm going to head into the next slide here. Brian.
Thanks, Heather. And thank everybody for being here. It's a great turnout. The slide that Heather just showed broke down the total capacity by state. And what I'm showing you now is one of the slides that I like best out of the report. It's actually from page 6, and it breaks down that capacity by utility. From time to time, you may hear me refer to this as the donut chart. Anyhow, what I'd like to focus on today is a comparison between FPL and TVA. These are two of the biggest utilities in the Southeast, so I thought we could consider some of the similarities and some of the differences. Both of them are generally recognized by their 3-letter acronyms, and both of them serve over 5 million customers. But that's really about as far as the similarities go. I mean, Florida Power and Light's an investor-owned utility. TVA is a federal entity. TVA is a generation and transmission utility that provides power to 153 local power companies for the final distribution to the retail customers. Florida Power and Light serves retail customers themselves. And importantly for this conversation, they are vastly different in their solar progress. What the report shows, including this slide on the screen, that Florida Power Light has about 5 times the amount of solar capacity that TVA has. For 2023, we're showing 5,150 megawatts for FPL and 1,098 megawatts for TVA. And not to jump ahead too much, but this difference will also be evident in that watts per customer ratio that Heather was mentioning as well. Even as another data point here to compare or contrast another utility, Dominion Energy South Carolina is on here. That utility in South Carolina serves less than 800,000 customers, yet they have more solar than TVA has. So just put that out there. And let's go on to the next slide. Heather hit some of this terminology already at the very beginning, difference between capacity and energy. The clarification at the bottom is that there's one page in the report. It's page 10. It's the one that Heather showed most recently, the breakdown of capacity by state, with the forecast by state. And that's where we report solar capacity in the state where it's physically located. All of the others, we are reapportioning the capacity to the state where the load is served. And as an example, we put in the report that approximately 656 megawatts of the solar that's installed in North Carolina actually serves load in South Carolina. And while I'm at it, there's one other thing that's not even on this slide, but it's described in the appendix, a discussion about the methodology, and you may have heard Heather refer to a full year operational equivalent at the beginning. That's because SACE affords partial credit for solar projects during their first year of operation. And this helps us keep the capacity and energy figures in balance, the megawatts and the megawatt hours. For example, a solar project that reaches commercial operation late in the year, like November or December, really doesn't generate that much energy during that first year. So we downscale that capacity in the first year as well. And then, of course, they'll get full credit in the data set every subsequent year, as long as they're operating for the full year. Lastly, I want to reiterate that watts per customer ratio. Heather described it already. It's the watts of installed capacity divided by the number of retail customers that are served either by that utility or in that state. And that is our primary metric, watts per customer, because it allows us to fairly and equitably compare large utilities and small utilities with large population compared to states with small populations. So the rest of the slides we're going to be showing are going to be focused on that watts per customer ratio. Let's go on to that part of the report. This slide is our leaderboard, both the backwards looking into 2023 as well as forward looking on a 4-year rolling time horizon. We do that in every report. So we're looking out to 2027 with our forward forecast here. And remember what I said about the difference between FPL and TVA being evident in the watts per customer ratio too. It is, you can see it here. FPL is certainly not at the top of the list, but their ratio is multiples of TVA's ratio. And that's not just in what's already been accomplished on the left-hand side, but in the forecast out to 2027 as well. We're showing FPL getting to 1,947 watts per customer in 2027, but we're only expecting TVA to achieve 621 watts per customer in that year, 2027. And it's that result, because that 621 is less than last year's region average, the 665 that's over in the middle in the yellow bar of the left-hand side. So that result and all those that are even less than that on the forecast get designated as our SunBlockers. So the TVA and Seminole have found themselves back on the SunBlocker list again in this year's report. Other than that, there really aren't many surprises on this list. Duke Energy Progress still sits at the top of both the backward-looking 2023 leaderboard as well as the forward forecast to 2027. Tampa Electric similarly is number 2 on both of those lists. I guess I would conclude that the leaders are continuing to lead and the laggards are continuing to lag. Next slide. All right, now this one is not actually in the report itself. It's a combination of tables that are in this report and a table from 4 years ago. So the left-hand side of this table, actually, it's, sorry, I flipped those. The right-hand side, the middle column there, the current 2023 watts per customer ratio is what I just showed you on the previous slide. But then the 2019 forecast of the 2023 watts per customer, that is pulled from the report 4 years ago where we were forecasting out. And I think it's useful to look back at this, but I think it's also important to have some context because in 2019 and early 2020, when we were assembling that prior report, let's face it, none of the utilities could have forecast the significance, the full extent of the COVID pandemic. And similarly, none of them anticipated the extent of the supply chain disruption that the solar industry faced in 2022. So I think that those two things really are what explain a lot of the red numbers, the negative numbers that are on this slide. That being said, there are 3 utilities that exceeded the forecast. And so I think they deserve a little attention. Duke Energy Florida clearly stepped up their game. They had actually been below the region average until just last year. And now they have the 5th highest watts per customer ratio on our leaderboard. So that's noteworthy. Oglethorpe has always been trending just below the region average, but they have consistently exceeded expectations. Now, we have less visibility into the planning processes of the co-ops than we do the regulated utilities. So I think that sort of explains how our forecast had been perhaps artificially low for them. But again, they've been consistently delivering. And I think that same thing is a contributing factor for the North Carolina electric cooperatives as well. We had a relatively low expectation for them, and they have exceeded that expectation. One last point before I hand the floor back over to Heather. In last year's report, we really emphasized one of the programs coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the New Era Empowering Rural America program, $9.7 billion that will help the rural co-ops transition to clean energy. And I still expect it to be a major game changer for that cohort of the region's utilities. Most, if not all of them, applied for some of that funding. And it's a competitive grant process, but those awards haven't been announced yet. So we don't know yet how to factor that into the co-op forecasts. SACE is eagerly awaiting those announcements, and I'm sure the utilities are eagerly awaiting them as well. And once we know which utilities are going to get those dollars, then we can factor that into some future forecasts. Heather, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So I'm going to close out this portion of the webinar with a couple of success stories in our region, as well as what's on the horizon for solar progress. So Sunrisers, this is our leadership category for the report, and this is measured by the change. So the increase over 4 years in the watts per customer ratio, basically how much higher the utilities are planning to be in 2027 versus 2023 in terms of solar. And one thing to note here is that there are several Florida-based Sunrisers that top the list this year. Notably, at the very top is the Municipal Utility System, Orlando's Utility Commission, or OUC. This is due primarily to their leadership, along with other members of the Florida Municipal Solar Project, and their plans to boost capacity to, I think it's over 270 megawatts by 2025. And a couple of other Florida utilities, there's Duke Energy Florida in the second slot, as well as Florida Power and Light a little bit further down the list, which I think we've mentioned a couple of times here, but basically the 3 of these utilities all appear on the list as reflecting a trend of both investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities increasing in the state of Florida. I think that's something that's reflected really, really well here. And elsewhere in the region, we have some other investor-owned utilities that are making plans to deploy more solar. So for example, Georgia Power and Duke Energy Progress, although some delays in construction or in signing power purchase agreements have historically made some of this potential slow to materialize, which I think is something that Brian kind of alluded to in the previous report. And then further down on the list, we have Santee Cooper and Walton EMC are both Sunrisers again this year. They've also appeared on this list in previous reports. So Santee Cooper is the state-owned utility in South Carolina. This is not based exclusively on their own plan. What's driving this is also that one of the subsidiary utilities, Central Electric Cooperative, has directly commissioned some solar as well. And that's actually a little bit of, I think Brian has said this in the past, and I'm going to repeat it again, but Santee Cooper is a success story because in our previous reports, they were actually listed as a SunBlocker. But now, after a couple of cycles of resource planning, they've actually managed to be on the Sunriser list for the 2nd year in a row. And then down at the bottom is Walton EMC. They've also been on the list before, and their watts per customer ratio is very high. And the reason that they're a little bit further down the list than they used to be is that a lot of the solar is now included in that base year in 2023, which means that they have kind of like further to go in the future to kind of add to the watts per customer ratio. So those are our sunrisers for this year. And I'm going to move along to this slide, finishing the report, the webinar by talking about, this is like a glimpse into what we think is coming down the line. So these are kind of macro topics that we see coming down the pike to influence our forecasts in the future. First off is resource planning, which is obviously a big one that's been mentioned a couple of times throughout the webinar. So Georgia Power, I think we mentioned this in the report, but they did file an interim or an update IRP last year that was unexpected. And unfortunately, that did not add any incremental solar to their plans, but they do have kind of a full IRP cycle coming up soon. So they're expected to file at the beginning of 2025. And then in the state of North Carolina, the Utilities Commission is expecting Duke, so that's both Duke Utilities, Duke Energy Progress, and Duke Energy Carolinas to finalize a carbon plan this year. That actually, as Brian mentioned earlier, also impacts the state of South Carolina, since Duke operates in both states. And then TVA's next IRP, it was set to be released in March, but that's been delayed to fall of 2024. So that is something that is expected in the future. And I just kind of want to reemphasize here how each of these big utility plans, each resource plan is an opportunity to add more solar to the grid, especially if it's paired with something like battery storage. Oh, actually, I'm going to talk about transmission planning here too. So, transmission is really important for enabling solar and other types of clean energy like wind. I'm going to highlight TVA here just because we mentioned that we're expecting their next IRP to come up soon. So TVA stated a couple of times that transmission is a really big barrier to increasing solar on its system. And TVA says that they're also going to start their first integrated transmission plan in the fall. And so, we remain hopeful that if they can proactively build out their transmission system to support solar, that perhaps it could move up in the rankings compared to other utilities in the region. Then we're also expecting, FERC has two orders. One is focused on transmission planning, and the other is focused on permitting for transmission, to be something that could potentially help the region add more solar in the future. Okay, and I'm going to move to the lower left-hand corner and talk a little bit about storage. So battery energy storage is something interesting that we're kind of expecting to include in future reports, but they're not included currently. So we're beginning to see a lot of the storage projects actually come online, nice like big utility scale projects. And interestingly enough, a lot of the data that they're reporting to federal data collectors like EIA allows them to distinguish what the storage is being used for. So one example is that a lot of utilities are in fact building storage specifically for the purpose of using excess solar or other types of clean energy. So I think that when utilities are projecting significant load growth and they're opting to build gas plants, they could instead be building solar and storage because together they perform pretty similar functions to some of the more traditional power plants. And so the last thing I want to talk about that people are probably wondering about is the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. So this is kind of the big federal climate policy. And there are a couple of things that we've already seen kind of reflected in the numbers. And one thing is that the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, those are something that were kind of extended I think extended to 30 years. And so that's really helping provide certainty to the market. But there are a couple of other programs that we're expecting to see kind of have an impact on the forecast in the future. And one is that the Solar for All program is something that is going to help distributed solar a lot in the region. It's actually, I think, 5 states in the region, and there's also a multi-state regional program that received Solar for All funding through, this is the competitive grant program. And so that's expected to help kind of residential customers, in particular low-income customers, be able to access solar. There's also a provision in the IRA called direct pay, which helps, this is something I think Brian mentioned earlier, but it helps low tax liability or tax exempt entities to access clean energy tax credits, just so it's a little bit easier for municipal systems or electric membership cooperatives to access financing for solar in a similar manner to how investor-owned utilities are able to do so. So that's it for the webinar. I think we're going to move on to the Q&A portion now.
Great, thank you, Heather. All right, so this is Maggie Schober with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. We have a number of questions coming in that have already come in. So I will be going through those for Heather and Brian to provide answers and responses. But if you do have a question you haven't asked yet, please go ahead and put that in using the Q&A function in the Zoom down there at the bottom below the presentation. All right, so first I think we can turn this one over to you, Brian, and then see if Heather has some insights as well. This report includes both owned solar generation and purchased solar generation. Could you describe why both is included? And is there a meaningful difference between the two? Thinking specifically about TVA, but also, maybe some other utilities across the Southeast, if certain utilities have preferences or financial incentives to do their own solar or purchase solar. And then in addition to that, well, we'll just start with that one. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so from SASA standpoint, to address the climate crisis that Steve laid out at the beginning, it really doesn't matter whether the utilities own the solar or a third party owns the solar. But there have been practical differences, and I'll come around and explain. Well, Heather just touched on it a little bit why things are changing now. But historically, nonprofit utilities couldn't take advantage of the main driver from the federal incentive standpoint, which was the investment tax credit. Because if they didn't have a tax liability, they couldn't use it. It wasn't refundable or direct pay. Inflation Reduction Act fixed that. So specifically to TVA, most of the solar that they had done up until now was through third parties, because a third party tax paying entity could structure the deal to where those tax credit values were being captured in the deal and not lost. Now with direct pay, organizations like TVA can actually get direct payment in the equivalent amount of the tax credit from the federal government. So it's entirely possible that we may start to see TVA or other nonprofit utilities, other co-ops throughout the region start to do projects that they own themselves.
Thanks, Brian. Kind of building off of that, this is again TVA focused. TVA often explains its solar lag because of concerns about reliability. But looking at FPL in the report, they had 14% of capacity last year and 6% of energy mix. So does what FPL is, what FPL has on their system and also what they're planning in the future, does that support TVA's argument that more solar would threaten reliability?
Well, now I started out with saying that there are differences, a lot of differences between FPL and TVA. And we need to be honest about that in this context as well. It's not in this report, but SACE had put out a report on seasonal demand for various utilities throughout the Southeast several years ago now. And the demand profiles for the two utilities are pretty significantly different. Florida Power and Light is a strongly summer peaking utility. TVA is much more likely to hit a winter peak, but that TVA hits all-time max loads during summer months as well. And obviously, solar contributes a whole lot more during a summer peaking event than in a winter peaking event, which tends to happen early mornings before the sun comes up. Storage coupled with solar will entirely change that. And Heather already mentioned how we're seeing solar with storage, those hybrid projects really taking off throughout the region. But so I don't think that I'm not buying TVA's argument on reliability. I think that is a smokescreen that a lot of utilities have started trying to hide behind. Solar does contribute. Most of our utilities hit summer peaks. So even the winter peaking utilities are more dual peaking than anything else. And solar has a capacity contribution that it can make reliably to those utilities. But they use these winter storm events, Winter Storm Elliott being an example of one, to scare people into thinking that the only choice that they really have is to build fossil gas generation at this point. And there's a lot of evidence out there that that's not entirely accurate.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll add to that, noting that in Winter Storm Elliott in particular, there were a lot of failures at both fossil gas and coal plants all across the region. So they're not exactly reliable in those situations either. All right.
I would add to that too, just some kind of rather late breaking news, but within the last week, one of our new nuclear units in Georgia, I'm based in Georgia, we just spent $35 billion in 15 years building 2 new nuclear units. Unit 3 has been down for several days. And it's supposed to be a 99% capacity factor, reliable resource. Well, right now it's not contributing anything, and solar has been really ticking along, hitting some maximum outputs in the last week or so because we've had such dry and clear conditions. We've had really good solar output.
Yes. Yeah, sounds like y'all are very glad to have that solar in Georgia right now. All right, Heather, here's a question for you. Thinking about Florida specifically, what does the current installed solar capacity in Florida mean for the state's overall energy landscape? How does that compare to, what they have going on for other energy sources?
Yeah, so for the overall energy landscape, yeah, I think it's important to note that this is the solar report, so we only talk about solar, but we do have a couple of other reports where we compare all the different types of generation. that utilities use and, are putting into their plans. And one thing I remember about Florida is that it's very gas heavy. So I think that the current installed solar capacity numbers that we're seeing in Florida are extremely promising. And, we hope to see them continue in the future. We hope that the plans that the utilities are making actually materialize. I know that Brian shared that slide earlier, kind of like looking at the comparison of the forecast and the actual. And I remember Florida Power and Light ended up being pretty close to what their plan said. So I'm hoping that is also the case for the other utilities in the state, because if they're also increasing kind of the load that they're expecting, which is something that I don't remember seeing much of in Florida, but it's something that's kind of happening throughout the country and throughout the region, is that utilities are forecasting significant demand for the first time in over a decade. And in order to meet that demand, some of the utilities are planning on building more gas plants. So, we're hoping that the good solar progress that we've seen in Florida, we're hoping that's not blunted by, the impact from, potential gas additions or even the existing gas generation in the state.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And that other report Heather was referring to, we call our decarbonization report. So be on the lookout for that later this year. And sticking with you, Heather, this question is specific to Florida, but maybe you can answer it for either, a state at the state level or across the region, which is, do we have an estimated breakdown of distributed solar between residential and non-residential or C&I customers, either at the state level or region-wide?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, and I was actually able to look up the answer while Brian was talking during the webinar. So I think the estimated breakdown is like 85 to 90% of the capacity comes from residential in Florida, and that's kind of interesting because I also looked at the US number and it's like 70%. So Florida does have kind of like a disproportionate amount of its distributed solar coming from the residential customer segment, which I think is really interesting. And so if that question came from a reporter, you can email me for a more kind of like exact answer, but that is kind of an interesting finding, and it's not something that we look into in the report, but maybe next year that is something that we're gonna look into.
Very cool. Yeah, it's a great question. Kind of thinking distributed solar lines, back to you, Brian. Does SACE make policy recommendations to utilities or public service commissions or state policymakers to increase distributed solar? And if so, what are they? This question was specific for TVA, but I'm going to ask it for all utilities, since I know that's something we look at across the region.
Okay, well, and the answer is yes. With regard to TVA specifically, SACE fought hard when TVA disbanded their distributed solar program. It was called GPP, Green Power Providers, and it was really disappointing when they sunset that program, and really kind of abdicated responsibility, because they basically then passed the baton off to their local power companies and said that they could design their own distributed solar programs. And then some of the local power companies went the wrong direction with it and started imposing solar surcharges, like standby fees, and SACE has tried to address those. NES, Nashville Electric Service, is one that imposed one of those solar standby fees, and we've been working to try to get that rescinded, because it's a punitive policy, and it makes it that much more difficult for homeowners who want to put solar on their roofs to be able to afford to do that. other jurisdictions, we have consistently recommended for Georgia, the um, for the Georgia Public Service Commission to require Georgia Power to reinstate a very successful pilot test that they had, that was referred to as monthly netting. So it wasn't true net metering, but it was a monthly netting process within the billing cycle, and then a true up at the end of each billing cycle based on the utility's avoided cost. Successful program with 5,000 customers in it. And we had witnesses testify in the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, and the rate case in 2022 to try to get that reinstated. And it wasn't a complete loss. We did not get monthly netting back, but one of the commissioners made a motion that carried, and so now it's done as instantaneous netting. We can talk about what that is or isn't, with the credit for any excess solar from a residential rooftop solar owner that goes out to the grid being compensated at avoided cost plus 4 cents. So it's better than it had been, but it's not as good as the recommendations that SACE and our witnesses had made. And then one other example comes to mind, in both North and South, where they had achieved a pretty robust level of rooftop solar penetration in early years. They both had net metering as an initial policy there, and both had legislation that were requiring the utility commissions to figure out what the next evolution of net metering would be. And so SACE, with a number of other parties, reached a settlement with Duke Energy and got what's now known as solar choice metering in North and South Carolina. And it is netting, but it's netting within time of use periods. So it kind of acknowledges that not all kilowatt hours are created the same and should be valued the same, because there are times of day and times of year when it costs the utility more to generate power than other times of day and times of year. So it nets out within those periods. And I think that was suitable for those markets, given their level of evolution in rooftop solar.
Thank you, Brian. That was a very helpful overview. I always find it interesting of where states and utilities are today based on, where they have been in the past, if they had a full net metering policy or not. All right. So moving back to Heather, we had a question about the 2023 solar capacity snapshot slide, and asking whether or not that other utilities category includes or excludes distributed.
Yes. So actually all of these figures include distributed. I think you probably heard us talk a lot about things in terms of specific utilities, but in the end, like all of these capacity figures that we're sharing include both utility scale solar and distributed. It just happens to be that utility scale makes up the majority of it. So that is what we talk about a lot. But yes, so for the other utilities, this is just kind of like smaller municipal utilities that aren't like members of like any of the other kind of major systems that we list here. And that does include both the utility scale that's either owned or purchased by the utility, and the distributed generation that is, owned by the customers of those utilities.
Great, thank you. I think that answered another question on our list too. There's a lot of questions about what figures include utility scale and rooftop. So that's helpful.
Yeah, I think I'll also note here that there is kind of a distinction between net metered solar and non-net metered solar, with I think Brian maybe talked about a little bit. But so the distributed solar figures include the solar that's net metered, or tariffed solar, or virtual solar. So these figures are relatively comprehensive.
Yes. I particularly like the question that came in. Somebody says they are a Duke Energy Progress customer and have solar panels, and asking if their solar watts are included in this report. So I would say yes, your your very own solar panels are included here. All right, Brian, question. I think this will be our last one because we're running close on time. What is the, can you talk a little bit about the difference between Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolina figures in watts per customer? Does it have to do with their service territories or customers or other factors at play?
Okay, yeah, well, and I think Heather kind of touched on this early, but I'll reiterate that both our historic numbers come from EIA predominantly, and our forecast is predominantly influenced by the utility's own planning processes. And in the case of both of the Duke utilities, it would be their integrated resource plans. And the reality is that Duke Energy Progress has more solar in their historic reports to EIA and in their forecast in their planning, their IRP. But it sounded like the second part of that was sort of why. And I think it can be attributed really to geography. If you think about North Carolina in particular, because I mean both Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas also operate south of the border in South Carolina. But when I think of them, I'm thinking North Carolina usually, and there's a part of North Carolina in the northeast corner that's served by Dominion, and they participate in the wholesale market of PJM, and we don't even include them in this report. I think Heather actually described that already. But the rest of the state is divided up between Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas, at least within the investor-owned utility parts. There's also co-ops and munis in there. And Duke Energy Progress has the vast majority of the central part of the state and a little pocket of Asheville. And Asheville's up in the mountains. And Duke Energy Carolinas has kind of the foothills and all that leads up into those mountains. It's just harder to put solar in those markets, at least utility scale solar, to get the large tracts of land to do projects, or even North Carolina has a history of these smaller 30-acre projects in the 5-megawatt AC range. It's even hard to get a flat enough field that's not obscured by other mountains and hills to be able to do as much as it is in the flat land. So I really attribute most of it to geography.
Great, thank you, Brian. All right. I think that will conclude. We are right at the hour. And so I appreciate, I'm sorry if we did not, we're not able to get to your questions, but I appreciate everyone tuning in. And thank you very much to Heather and Brian for an informative report and webinar. Please take a look at the report as well. And we will be sending out a recording to everyone that registered for the webinar. Thank you so much.